Fresh raspberries are one of my favorite things about summer, and desserts are also one of my favorite things. So today I'm making raspberry sherbet from scratch. I'm turning these fresh raspberries into homemade sherbet to find out whether it tastes better, costs less, and is easy enough to make again, or whether this is one grocery store staple we should just keep buying. Hi everyone, and welcome to From Scratch Fridays, where every week we're making something that most of us usually buy at the grocery store to see if it's actually worth making ourselves. Sometimes it saves money, sometimes it tastes better, sometimes it lets you control the ingredients or use what you already have, but sometimes it's just not worth the effort. At the end of the video, I'll score the homemade sherbet to the grocery store version based on taste, cost, and time/effort. Raspberry sherbet is an interesting test because it sits somewhere between an ice cream, which we all know and love as a great summer dessert, and a sorbet. It has the bright, full flavor of that sorbet, but that small amount of dairy that gives it a softer, creamier texture and makes it a little bit more like an ice cream. Sherbet is actually my personal favorite since it feels like summer to me because I get that creaminess that we all know and love from ice cream, but then we can use all those summer fruits as well. So today we're making a raspberry sherbet, but in the past I've made a pineapple sherbet. You could also do lemon, you could do lime, maybe even a strawberry sherbet. And one of my favorite things to do with the sherbet is to make 7-Up floats. So it's much like a root beer float, but instead of root beer, you have 7-Up, or you could also do Sprite. And then instead of vanilla ice cream, we do our sherbet. And these are one of my all-time favorite summer desserts. You'll have to let me know in the comments below if you've ever tried a 7-Up float. So for this recipe, you don't really need many ingredients. 12 ounces of fresh raspberries, 3/4 of a cup of water, 1 cup of sugar, which is about 198 grams, 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt, 3 tablespoons of fresh lemon juice, 2/3 of a cup of heavy whipping cream, and then 1 tablespoon of vodka. And vodka might be surprising, but really the purpose of the vodka in this recipe is to just help make it smoother since it lowers the melting point slightly. It is optional, so if it is something you're worried about, you can leave it out, but your sherbet will just have a little bit coarser of a texture. Okay, now let's dive into the recipe. The first step is essentially to make the raspberry syrup. So you're going to do that over the stove. So we're going to add our water, our sugar, our salt, and then all of our 12 ounces of raspberries. I'm going to give that a mix. And we're going to have this over about medium heat for about 7 minutes or until it comes to a simmer. All right, so this is done simmering. So then the next step in the recipe is just to pour it over a fine mesh strainer into a larger bowl. And then once you pour it in through the strainer, you want to use a spatula or something soft like that just to push against the strainer to make sure you get all the various pieces through. So you can see I have all the raspberry juice strained into this bowl. And then the next step is to add our lemon juice, and then that little bit of vodka. And then I'm just gonna pop this in the freezer for about an hour, and then we'll come back and pick up then. All right, so it's been about an hour and my raspberry mixture has cooled. So then the next step of the recipe is to take our 2/3 of a cup of heavy whipping cream and whip those till they form soft peaks. Now that our soft peaks have formed, the next step of the recipe is to pour our raspberry mixture into the cream while mixing. All right, now that that's all mixed, I'm just gonna pour it into the ice cream maker and let that go for about 20 minutes or until it starts looking thick and like a sherbet should. The sherbet just finished turning in the ice cream maker for about 20 minutes, so it's all set to move into our container. You can see it's a nice, thick, that beautiful pink from the raspberries. So I have these specialized ice cream containers that I got on Amazon, but if you don't have them, that's totally fine. You can just use a bread pan. The key here is you just want it to have a high surface area to volume ratio, so relatively wide compared to its depth. So I'm just gonna go ahead and scoop all of this delicious sherbet into our container. I'm gonna go ahead and put saran wrap over the top and make sure it gets right on the surface to prevent any air from getting in there. And then I'm gonna pop it in the freezer for a minimum of 3 hours. Okay, so it's been about 3 hours. So now I'm gonna do a taste test. On my right here, I have the homemade sherbet, and on my left, I have the store-bought sherbet. Immediately, you can see the color's a little bit different. The homemade one is slightly pinker. The store-bought one is a little deeper red. Oop, and and Mr. Coco wants to help with the taste test. You can't eat that, buddy. So I'm gonna go ahead and give our homemade one a try. That's so, it's very light. You can tell it has a little bit of creaminess from the whipping cream, but also still has a little bit of that tanginess from the raspberries and that lemon juice that we put in. Super smooth, great texture, perfect summer dessert. All right, let me go ahead and try the store-bought one. Texture is very similar to the homemade one, also very smooth, very creamy. There is a slight difference in the creaminess though. I feel like you can tell that we used a milk product in the homemade one. The creaminess doesn't come across quite as well in the store-bought one. The store-bought one also isn't quite as tangy, but also very good. It has that, kind of artificial raspberry flavor that we all sort of know and love. So very similar, slight differences. So now let's compare the two in terms of cost. For the cost comparison, we compared everything on a per quart basis because that is about how much we made. For the store-bought sherbet, it was $3.13, and for the homemade version, it was about $9.18. The ingredient that contributed the most to this cost was the raspberries. 12 ounces of raspberries came out to be between $6 and $7. So depending on how much your raspberries cost, that will likely dictate how expensive the homemade version is. The store-bought doesn't include as many real raspberries as the homemade sherbet. It mainly gets its flavor from raspberry concentrate and other, quote, natural flavors. The other main component of cost was the heavy cream, which came out to about $1 and change for the homemade sherbet. For the store-bought sherbet, they don't use heavy cream at all, which is probably why it's not as creamy. They use skim milk and other thickeners to create the creamy texture. In terms of active time, the homemade sherbet takes about 25 to 30 minutes, which includes making the raspberry syrup, whipping the heavy cream, and all the various prep. In addition, there is chilling the syrup for an hour and then freezing the final product for at least 3 hours, which doesn't add to the active time, but does add significantly to the total time. All right, so now the real question is making homemade sherbet worth it? And I think honestly, in this case, the answer is probably no. Don't get me wrong, the homemade sherbet was excellent. The flavor was great, it was creamy, it was light, it was tangy, it had a great raspberry flavor. So really nothing wrong with the recipe. It's just that the store-bought sherbet doesn't really taste that different. And so when you start comparing it in terms of the other things like the cost and the time, that's when the store-bought one, I think, starts to pull ahead because the homemade one is definitely more expensive, a little bit. It definitely takes a good amount of time to do. It's not very hard, but there are a lot of steps where you have to wait and you have to do everything with the raspberries at the beginning. So I think all in all, I would probably just stick with the store-made version. That's a wrap on this From Scratch Friday. Let me know in the comments if there's any other recipes you would like me to try. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.